Okay, today we're going to talk about painting, just one of the artistic mediums. So let me switch over to my screen and we'll get started. So artists use all kinds of paint. There's tempera paint, which you've probably heard of, gouache, which is a designer's paint, casein, which actually is a paint made out of milk, encaustic, fresco, oil paint, acrylic paint, watercolor paint, kind of everything. And the big difference between artist paints and house paints, artist paint values color and permanence, and house paint is more about environmental stability and durability. It's got additives like anti-mold and rot compounds and other ingredients. And painting materials like oil paints are a type of wet media. So they are attaching themselves to a surface chemically. The paint is bonded or glued to the surface through the binding action of its components. And there are three components to paint. There's the pigment, so that's the color. There's the binder, and that's the actual medium. And then there's the vehicle. So the pigment gives the color. The binder mixes with the pigment to hold the particles in place, and the vehicle helps to thin or spread the pigment. You can use the vehicle also to clean up the paint. So in watercolor, we've got pigment, and then we've got gum arabic, which is a tree sap, and then we've got water. So water is the vehicle. We can thin out the paint, or we can also use water to clean up the paint. So think of it this way, pigment makes the color, the binder holds it together, it's the glue, and the vehicle thins the paint. And pigments are consisting of natural or chemical substances, and sometimes dyes are the pigments. And dyes are basically stained substances, like plant extracts that are used to color another substance, like a natural base. A lot of you maybe know about the cochineal beetle, whose shells are crushed up to make red. Um, One of the reds that's widely popular in cosmetics, like lipstick, red beetle. Actually, the beetles are white until they're crushed up, just so you know. Um, Pigments are powdered. Um, and in the 19th and 20th centuries, there's been major advances in the chemical industry, making it possible to produce more than just mineral pigments, synthetic pigments that really extend the different kinds of colors we can get. Watch this video about lapis lazuli. Lapis lazuli is one of the substances people at sometimes have called the philosopher's stone. Watch this one. Watch this one about industrial grade pigments. And as I mentioned, years ago, artists had a few choices. I mean, many years ago, um, hundreds to thousands even. Maybe few as 5 or 6. Remember when we looked at drawing media and how few colors you could make? Well, it's similar with paint because you're essentially using the same source material to make paint. This day, there's just hundreds, even thousands of different kinds of pigments and colors that we've got. So we'll look at a few types in more detail. And notice that most of these names are derived from the name of the binder, except for watercolor. So like oil paint, we name it for the binder, which is oil. But watercolor, interestingly, is named for the vehicle, which is water. So watercolor, as I mentioned, pigment, gum arabic, and water. Very portable, ideally suited for landscape work especially, and it dries fast. Um, Developed and widely used in the Victorian era when traveling to see the natural world became really fancy and fashionable. So you can imagine how easy it is to carry around one of those little watercolor kits and make a painting. It's thin, lends itself to washes and layering really readily. Encaustic. Encaustic is a really ancient medium of suspending pigments in beeswax, which really results in a lustrous surface. Um, so you would heat up the beeswax and mix in pigment, and then when the wax dries, you end up with this solid paint layer. And usually derived from natural sources like ochre, iron oxide, carbon, like we saw with drawing, so charcoal, and calciums like chalk or bone. And now more modern pigments are available. Um, Again, binder is beeswax, the vehicle is heat. And because of this, the vehicle and the binder. So you can imagine that we've got to have heat to make the paint. Um, and if the binder is wax, once it's cold, it's rigid, right? So we have to have a solid surface that's not going to move in order for these paintings to survive. Um, Early Christian Egyptians called the Copts used encaustic painting quite a lot. This is a painting from a sarcophagus painted on wood. And because of the delicacy, it could also melt in direct sunlight. So it's not as widely used today, but there are artists who use it to very cool effects. So here's a video about an artist who uses it today. Really cool. Really kind of dangerous to use sometimes because they'll put in turpentine and other substances to change the behavior of the wax, and that can be really noxious fumes. Um, Tempera paint is actually using the egg yolks to um, it's the whites to make the binder. Again, we've got the basic pigments being used and modern pigments available now. So the egg white becomes the glue, and then the vehicle here again is water. Um, Developed by the Egyptians and Greeks, but really highly used during the Middle Ages when it was used for small paintings. Um, Just a side note, the Middle Ages are in Europe are from about 280 to around 1000 AD. So from the fall of the Roman Empire to the very early beginnings of the Renaissance. Um, so again, it was really highly developed, and then it kind of goes through this period where it's a little less developed until it gets up to Renaissance era. You can see also, interestingly, there's gold leaf. There's that's been applied to the top of this painting up at the top. That's called gilding. And that was used when there was enough money around to get gold. Um, Dark Ages, medieval, marked by a world that's broken up into kingdoms, essentially. Um, but for China, which was already established as a larger single nation. Good to note that medieval Europe produced little lasting work. Most was lost. Surviving paintings, usually religious in subject matter. Cheap, readily available. Easy to get eggs, right? It's quite opaque, dries fast, dries matte. It's a pretty stable paint. Water thinned, so we've got that water vehicle. And then we've got oil paint up next, a favorite for centuries now. Pigments mixed with drying oils. So you know that cooking oil doesn't dry out, right? It stays liquidy, but some oils do dry. So linseed oil, certain vegetable oils, I will say, walnut oil, poppy seed oil. Just to mention, linseed oil comes from the flax seed, the flax plant. So a lot of people eat flaxseed. Um, and this builds out of people finding out that these oils would dry out, and they might use some of it during the late Dark Ages. So there's not just this switch at the end of the Dark Ages, medieval period, automatically into Renaissance, right? Everything kind of runs together. And it's not until really the 1400s that it develops fully. And we'll see a slide in a few moments that some of you should recall. Um, Pigments, again, anything natural, all the way up to modern pigments. And lakes. So lake pigments are what we call pigments that are dyes. The vehicle here is turpentine. So that's from coniferous trees, and you can kind of smell it if you've ever been around the bark of a pine tree. Um, so this is thinning the paint by chemical means. It won't work. Water won't work to thin out oil paint. But so because of that, you can actually oil paint underwater. Now we use turpentine and mineral spirits. Mineral spirits tend to smell a little less than turpentine, just a bit less poisonous. Some notes about pigment, and here's a couple videos about pigment and grinding oil paint. So how to hand grind oil paint, I'm making a canvas, machine-made oil paints, paint making eye candy. I want to note that unlike something like encaustic, oil paint dries with a little bit of flexibility. So you can use it on something that is going to flex a little bit like fabric. So that's a huge advantage. You wouldn't be able to have these giant oil paintings if they cracked so easily, right? They still crack. Whenever I get formulas wrong, my paintings crack when I roll them up and they get ruined. They do oil sticks as well. So this is where you've got oil and a little bit of wax in it. And then you can use the turpentine to smudge it around. So just like regular oil paint. So it's stiff enough to be used like crayons, and combined nicely with regular oil paint as well. Really good for gestural stuff. So we know about Van Eyck from the marriage portrait we've seen a billion times. They are the ones who really refine the process. Um, Advantages, slow drying time, which allows you to blend and blend and blend and rework colors. So thin layers will dry in a day or two, really thin layers. A little bit thicker, days or weeks, a little bit thicker and thicker, months and months, sometimes even a year to fully dry out. Can be painted really transparent or really opaque. And the color, this is important, the color changes very little from when it's wet to when it's dry. So the vehicle and the binder are really stable in that sense. So when it gets shiny, it stays looking shiny when it dries. If you knock it down a little bit to make it matte, it stays matte when it dries. Again, it's flexible. You can paint it on canvas. Make it thin, shiny, thick, or matte. So here's the painting we all know, right? It's creating these layers of luminosity through different layers of oil paint and glazes. Glazing is when you've got a bunch of transparent films stacked up on top of each other. It's applied over dry layers. So you can imagine as you get thicker and thicker into the painting, it's going to take just a little longer and a little longer to dry until you can paint right over it. And so what's happening is that the paint is shining through the layers on top and then bouncing off of a white background. And we call the white background you put on a canvas gesso. So gesso seals up the fabric canvas so that the oil doesn't seep through into the fibers and ruin the canvas. But the light passes through the layers of paint, bounces back at your eyes, and because it's bouncing back through that those layers, those luminous layers, it looks really realistic and intense. You can make it look realistic, idealized, however you want. We can make oil paint look like humans and human skin. There's an argument that oil paint was developed to more accurately depict the colors and changes in depicting people and the way their skin looks. So that's an interesting theory. Mona Lisa, I hate this painting. Um, I think it's just blah. Everyone, and when I say that in class, everyone's like, "What?" Everyone thinks this painting is the greatest painting in the world, and I think if you just look at it, you're like, "What? What's so special about this?" I don't know. Maybe it's some kind of sacrilege that I say that, but I mean, this painting, I'm just like, whatever. Light coming in, light bouncing off. So the darker areas are going to be thicker because they're not letting as much light pass through. Lighter areas are going to be thinner because they're letting a bunch of light go into the painting and bounce back at our eyes. Here's a little movie, not a movie really, a short about the Mona Lisa. This painting I like a lot better, but here's an oil painting in a much different style and a much different light, essentially. And later on, though, in general, artists use it for its saturation. So for the amount of color and density you could get down at once, focusing a bit less on the layering we were talking about, and more just about the opaque possibility of oil paint. You should definitely watch this about that painting. This painting's amazing. Alla Prima. So, in contrast to the slow, methodical glaze painting we just talked about, Alla Prima means at the first. So that describes a painting that is completed in one sitting. So kind of like what you would do with watercolor a lot. So Alla Prima is like all at once. I'm going to sit down and make this whole painting all at once. We call it wet onto wet as well, because obviously being oil paint, when you come back over an area, it blends a little bit. There's no drawing underneath. Usually, there's not a lot of planning. It's just capture the subject right now, expressive brush strokes. And here's an example, another example. Building on top of that idea, we've got impasto. So impasto is when you've got really thick paint and it's just liberally applied. So you would use brushes or palette knives or whatever, and we've got this real actual texture to the paint surface. And you can see how chunky it is. That's coming off the edge of the canvas, just kind of everything. It's real material use of the medium. We've seen his work before. Impasto, thick. And a lot more contemporary painting uses a variety of techniques. And you guys saw this even when analyzing style. So we've got sometimes a combination of styles happening in a work. Well, we've got a combination of paint usage happening in work. Watch this. Here's one of mine, a lot of impasto happening, a lot of actual physical thickness of the paint happening. Okay, acrylic paint. So it's a mixture of a pigment and a plastic binder that can be thinned with water. So that's what's interesting about it. It's a plastic that can be thinned with water. And unlike linseed oil, the synthetic resin of the binder dries colorless and is not yellow. So I mentioned that the oil paint dries closely the way it looks while it's wet. That doesn't attest to its permanence of color in several hundred years. Oil paint does tend to yellow as it gets older and older, just by the nature of the oil. Synthetic resin doesn't yellow. So that's an important difference and a good reason why an artist might want to use acrylic. The film of it is flexible, a lot more flexible than oil paint. It dries fast, as many of you know, can be used on any kind of surface essentially, and it really needs not much surface preparation either. Same as oil pigments, essentially. Here's something though. The binder is a polymer derived from petrochemicals. Is a type of plastic. So everyone thinks if you've got a water-based media, because it's water-based and that's the vehicle, and you clean it up with water, that it's a good, safe, environmentally friendly medium. But nothing can be further from the truth. It's essentially microscopic beads of plastic that you're washing down the sink when you wash off acrylic paint. To me, that's something to really consider when you're choosing between paint kinds. And so if you do use it, know that you're using it. And I use some acrylics. Um, Whereas if you're using oil, the oil paint is actually way more environmentally friendly. A lot of people don't know that. Acrylic paint's kind of bad for the environment. We use all kinds of different ways. This is a screen print. Rapid drying, glazes can be layered in minutes, versatile, flexible with little or no cracking, can be painted on many surfaces. The disadvantage, acrylic is generally a little less intense of color compared to oil paint. So in my opinion, the light doesn't bounce around as much with acrylic paint as does with oil paint. And really, because it's so new, um, its permanence is not really known, but they think that because it's a synthetic resin, it'll last for just as long or probably a lot longer than oil paint. And we can use it in all sorts of different ways. And maybe some of you are familiar with all the different mediums of oil or acrylic paint. You can add all kinds of junk to it to make it different amounts of shininess or matteness or thickness or really kind of whatever you want. Um, Watch this about different mediums. And it first came into use in the 50s and 60s. That's when it was developed, kind of the tail end of abstract expressionism. And some of the artists experimented with the new medium. So until then, you really had everything based on oil. House paint was based on oil. Kind of everything in the painted world was based on oil. So It's a really, really recent medium. Look at this. This is weird. This is acrylic, but this weird mix of idealization and the realistic. It's a really strange painting. Liechtenstein, a pop artist. Brushes, all kinds of different kinds of brushes to do what you want. This isn't just for acrylic paint. This is just a note. All sorts. My favorite to use is an angled shader. If you ever see one of those in the store, or if you're ever in the art store and you want to see one of those, it's really versatile. Fan blenders are very popular because they look so cool. And then all other different sorts. You've got wash brushes to put thin layers on. You've got really tiny brushes to put details on. You've got liners, so you can fill it with paint and put a long line of paint wherever surface you're using. All right, frescoes. Um, so wall painting has been practiced by everyone, essentially. And the preferred medium for wall painting is buon fresco. So that means good or true fresco. And that's where you've got pigment mixed into the plaster. So you're taking pigment and mixing it into clay, basically. And so the medium, the binder, is mixed into the pigment just the way we would any other paint. The painting literally becomes part of the structure of the wall, not load-bearing structure, but it becomes a permanent attachment to the wall. You have to work quickly, so you work in really small areas at one time because you can only go so far before it dries. Fresco means fresh, by the way. So here's the basic technique. You would put a smooth layer of thin wet plaster, trowel to top, a rougher layer of dry plaster. And this is the intonaco applied over the aratio. So the aratio is the first layer. And so you want to make yourself a guide for what you're going to paint. And so you have a drawing, you prick little holes around all the outlines, and then you get a bag of charcoal and you pounce it. So what you're left with is the charcoal on little dots on the wall. And so the paper is removed and you've got the outlines left over. And the resulting outlines are called a cartouche, right? So the root word for cartoon, that's where it comes from. The artist paints in wet plaster. It dries and sets. Pigments in the water-based paint are bound into the other layer and colors lighten. The colors lighten because you've got plaster and lime in there. So you've got carbonates in there, or calcinites in there, rather. So it's white, essentially. So you don't have these ultra saturated colors in a fresco because you've got calcium mixed in, which is white. Watch this. And you can see here where Michelangelo has used grooves scratched out for his cartooning, incising the intonaco with a stylus. And you can see, look how he had second thoughts on some of the areas. You see the arm the way it turned out, and then the arm the way it did not turn out. Sistine Chapel. And And so this goes back to what we were talking about with the cartoon and maybe drawing with a stylus. Um, you don't just go up there and paint, right? And you've got to have a whole plan ready to go. So you've got sketches and studies ready to go. Look at that. He's painted himself down into the corner of that cell. So recently, the Sistine Chapel was cleaned. Um, hundreds of years of candle soot and smoke or whatever made everything super dark and made the varnish crack on it. So it needed to be cleaned up. And so they took samples out, basically figured out what was wrong, and figured out the kinds of dirt that were all in the pits and grooves of the surface of the fresco, and then figured out how they're going to sort it out. You can see on the left how dark that is, and on the right what it looks like when it's cleaned. Look at that. Isn't that amazing? That's crazy. You can read about this if you want. It's just a little bit about what sort of soap essentially they use to clean with. Basically apply this gel and then they pull it off and what's stuck to it is dirt. They also had to deal with previous restorations that weren't done quite as well. So you've got to fix not only the soot and dirt that was accumulated on it, you've also got to fix the restorations that were attempted, 50, 60, and 100 years back. And so I just want to show you what it looks like now that's been cleaned. It's amazing how bright it is and lively it is compared to the original images that we saw of this. Probably the most famous scene, right? Atmosphere of electricity. Hand of God reaches out to spark spiritual life in Adam without touching him. The viewer fills in this little gap. Just to mention another type, because we've got this other famous painting, right? Fresco Secco. And what's going on here is that you've got dry fresco. So you've got dry clay already on the wall. It's not wet, and we know we want it to be wet. And then essentially it's painted on top, right? So it's the pigment is not mixed into the clay. It's that the painting is on the wall, not a part of the wall. So this is a way you can use a lot of care, right? You could take longer to do this because you don't have wet plaster drying, but as you can see, it ages terribly. So this is what the actual Last Supper looks like. It falls apart essentially. Here there's a crack in the plaster, a piece of the painting falls away. Whereas in blonde fresco, if there's a little crack, it comes off, and then you've still got the color behind there because the color is embedded within the plaster. Okay, that is it, and I'll see you next time.